All right, today we're going to talk about a pretty neat tool. You guys know I like to show free tools. This is one that we started using after Steve came by and kind of helped us revamp our testing suite. And I'm referring to Intel PresentMon. Actually, it should be called TAP PresentMon because it was actually designed by Tom Peterson, formerly of NVIDIA, chip engineer who is now working with the Intel Arc program. So I'm going to show you guys PresentMon because it is an infinitely powerful tool when it comes to trying to diagnose, troubleshoot, or even just log and learn more about your systems. And you can actually start to figure out and see what bottlenecking actually really looks like. So it's a fun tool. We're gonna try it out today. It's totally free. Link is down below. And yeah, let's get right to it. The XG2736 and the XG2536 gaming monitors from Viewsonic feature 240Hz default refresh rates, 1 millisecond response time mode, and industry-leading 0.5 millisecond moving picture response time modes that are ideal for gamers demanding a competitive edge. Designed with eSports in mind, these XG monitors feature fully adjustable and low-profile footprint stand for optimal viewing distance that professional gamers demand. To learn more about the XG2736 1440p and XG2536 1080p competitive gaming panels from Viewsonic, follow the link in the description below. Before we get started, I want to remind you guys about my international PC giveaway that we're doing right now. It's going to be ending in just a few days. So if you guys aren't aware of that, go and check out the link down below. Actually, we'll link you to my Twitter, which will link you to the giveaway because YouTube's stupid rules and whatnot. But it's a very expensive system that actually turned out pretty sick. It's like a white kind of a snowblind build with a black GPU, but I digress, it doesn't matter. Totally free, worldwide, except for those countries where it's not allowed. So check it out if you're unaware of what I'm talking about. That way you guys aren't finding out after the fact and then you just hate life because that means you had absolutely zero chance. With that said, let's go ahead and get right into it. So the tool that we're talking about here is Intel PresentMon. Now you might see PresentMon, like you might see a few different versions of PresentMon. So make sure it's Intel PresentMon. Once you open it up, it's a very simple tool. And what I love about this tool and what makes it different from something like, say, Hardware Info 64 is the polling rate. The polling rate is extremely important because there's a lot of things, especially when we're talking about frame timing, and we'll talk about that in a moment and what frame times mean and how they actually are relevant to you. When you do something like Hardware Info 64 or HW Monitor or, I mean, I don't know what other monitoring software is out there, but they have a very slow polling rate. Basically 1000 milliseconds is typical because the faster and more frequently you're polling the GPU for information or the CPU, or heck, I mean, I don't have it installed in this system, we don't use it anymore. I guess I should probably though because of my PMD, but I digress. The faster you poll for information, the more those devices have to pause what they're doing to report back to the software what it is they're doing. Now the cool thing about the way PresentMon is designed is it's not actually like asking the GPU for information. It's more or less just in sync with the GPU, displaying it as it's doing it. So it's not telling, it's not basically, how should I describe this? So it's got a much faster polling rate. And the reason why this tool is what Steve recommends, and I was kind of ignorant to and didn't even know really existed, to be honest, is the fact that if you're looking for things like transient spikes, say in frame timing, or click to photon, which is actually something that you can measure with this tool, which is pretty awesome. That means how long did it take from the moment you clicked an input on a mouse or a keyboard till when it displayed on the screen. So you can really start, and that's something that matters obviously with things like frame gen, when we talk about the 5070 being a 4090 and all that crap. So things that you can actually measure, not as accurate as say if you were doing it hardware-wise, where there's actual camera hooked up to the click that will measure when it responds on the screen, but it's better than nothing. But the fact that when you're polling at 1000 milliseconds or one time per second, you are gonna miss those transient spikes where you might have only a couple of frames that took, instead of 2.5 milliseconds to draw, 25 milliseconds to draw. And those can be completely missed when it comes to monitoring software like HW64. So PresentMon is huge when it comes to the speed at which it can poll. Anyway, when you open up PresentMon, this is what you're kind of met with here. So you have a process up here. This is basically what the hook. This is where it's going to automatically detect whatever game or process is currently running that is a rendered screen, so it doesn't even have to be a game. It's just anything that's 3D rendered. In fact, some windows you open up will pop up PresentMon because you realize, like, why is the GPU rendering this in a 3D instead of a 2D type of render? But whatever, you know, it's the way the programmers design certain pieces of software. But as you can see right here, auto target says it's just going to show the highest, or it's going to target whatever is using the GPU the most, is essentially what that is saying. And that's why I said some Windows prompts will show it, because it's like, why is this prompt being, whatever, I already said that. Hotkey overlay, this is programmable. And it's kind of hard to find a keystroke combo that doesn't interfere with a game sometimes. Like, I actually had to change my capture key from F11 to F10 because certain games that I was trying with F11 was actually doing something in the game. So rather than remap the game, I just remapped my hotkey. But anyway, so Control-Shift-O is so that you can bring the overlay, you can show the overlay or hide the overlay while you're in game. We'll demonstrate that in a moment. So you have your presets. This is the information that is shown. So we'll show you what these are in a moment. We have basic, GPU focus, power temp, or custom. We're using custom because you can go in here and like tell it what stuff you want it to present. So right now we have it set up in a pretty light mode. Right now it's really GPU centric when it comes to the way it's set up. So we have the GPU name, obviously. Presented FPS. What I love about this is you can, if you open up any sort of FPS monitoring tool, it's gonna show you raw. As fast as it can read how many frames are being drawn, it's gonna show that. Which is why sometimes you look at a frame monitor and it's changing so freaking fast you can't read the stupid thing because it's happening so quickly. We have it set right now to average. So it's gonna average out the FPS and present that to us as a number. But we can look at the 99th percentile, we can look at the 95th percentile, the 90th percentile, we go at 1%, 5%, 10%, just show us the max FPS, whatever the max number is, show us the minimum, or raw. Raw is that fast changing number I talked about. Now we leave it as average here, and right now it's just a readout, but we can make it a graph. And again, I'll demonstrate all this in practice, but first I want to go through the software. Right now we just have it showing a number, but you can do a graph. That way if you did a graph, you could see a perceived dip in FPS, like, whoa, that seems stuttery, and you would see it in the graph. Right now set it to readout because we're just simply logging. As we're preparing for the 50 series testing right now, we're doing regression testing. We're just logging the FPS because we just need the average numbers. The average FPS, the 95th percentile, and the 99th percentile are the three numbers that we're capturing. So we're not doing 1% and 0.1% lows. We're essentially doing 1% and 5% lows is essentially what we're doing. But if we were doing live monitoring where we want to watch it as it's happening and not log it and look at it later, we could have it draw a graph, which would be neat because then we could kind of see any dips and fluctuations here. CPU busy. This is an important one because this is what we can use to determine whether or not, if we're seeing any sort of fluctuating GPU utilization or any sort of issues regarding the GPU not seeming like it's going to full load, this will help us determine if we are CPU bound. So we can actually compare the CPU busy time versus GPU busy time. And if the CPU busy time is higher than the GPU busy time, then that means we're pretty much gonna be CPU bottlenecked at that point. That means our GPU is gonna be waiting on our CPU. Typically those numbers would be the same. If the CPU number matches the GPU number, and again, we'll demonstrate it, if they're roughly the same, that means we are GPU bound, where the CPU is only working as hard as the GPU is sending in information. So we can show you that in a practical use in a moment here. That will make sense. GPU temp, pretty obvious, that's also an average. GPU frequency, GPU util, and GPU memory size used. That's cool because it's actually gonna show us, as far as I understand it, the true GPU memory that's being used. When you do it with something like MSI Afterburner, you're seeing what the request for memory usage is. But this can actually show you what memory used is, which is kind of nice, especially as we're now moving into the discussions about 16 gigabytes of VRAM potentially in the next few years may not be enough for certain titles. With games like Indiana Jones requiring 16 gigabytes of VRAM means that you 12 gigabyte VRAMs or 8 gigabyte VRAM cards are starting to really fall behind in terms of VRAM util. So it allows us a way to be able to truly look at that. And it allows you a way to be able to determine too if a game that you're playing is basically on the edge of your VRAM that's available to it. So that's why I love this tool, because you can start to really troubleshoot and diagnose, well, anything, but you can start to ask yourself, hey, do I need an upgrade? Do I feel like I need an upgrade, or do I actually need one? And this tool will help you determine that. But we can see our frame time, displayed FPS, presented GPU time, busy GPU wait, dropped frames, sync interval, present flags, present mode, runtime allows tearing, click to photon latency, which is what I was talking about. It's kind of neat. But as you can see, you've got all kinds of stuff available to you. Now, what I love about the fact that this is designed by an actual GPU engineer like Tap is it's the lowest overhead. I already talked about polling software can actually severely impact performance. I've seen as much as 5,000%, wow, 5,000 point hit in a high-end CPU in something like Cinebench R23 by having certain software util monitoring softwares open. And if you have more than one open, they're both fighting for that communication, and then it hits the performance even harder. But this tool right here allows us to do the capture that we need to do without impacting performance because it's written by an engineer himself. Now, everything that this can do, so can Hardware Info 64. What I've already talked about is the fact that Hardware 64 does have a bigger kind of overhead impact on the components, but too slow of a polling rate. So let's go ahead and do this in practical use case here so you guys can see how this is actually important and the benefit of having a free utility like this. Okay, so here I am right now. This is Horizon Forbidden West, but it's not showing up right now. So we could hit our Windows key, go back to PresentMon, and see right here, it's not set to auto target. I like to manually do it usually. So if I click process, it'll see it right there. And there it is right there. So you can see it's very tiny. And one of the reasons why it's so tiny is the fact that I had made it small for when I'm doing a lot of my benchmarking as we're moving forward right now. But let me go ahead and adjust that. So you can change which corner of the screen it's in that way. You can change its width, right? You make it all the way across the screen just about if you wanted. That way you can have longer graph. Time scale is how much time is the width of the graph. So if I was to make that 0.1, as you can see, it's moving very quickly across the screen. So I have it now made so it takes 10 seconds for it to come all the way across the screen. I'd like it to go higher than 10. So Tap, if you're watching, maybe up to 30 would be kind of nice if you're able to do that. Unless this has something to do with overhead, then obviously you know more than I do. Also, 2 graphic scaling factors, so you can make it bigger or smaller if you want. So obviously you can play with the factor scale there. I don't need this to be so wide, so we'll go like back to right there. And then the draw rate, the rate at which to draw the overlay. So this is kind of like FPS, if you will. You see how this is a bit jerky? This helps with the overhead. So you want to keep it a low draw rate because you don't need it to be super smooth. But we can go all the way up to 120 FPS. Now look how, well, you can't see it probably because you're 30 FPS video, but now it's 120 Hertz refresh rate. So we'll just leave that at 10 for overhead purposes. If we go back to here, you can see right now we just have the basic overlay. So GPU focus now is going to show us more stuff, but with the just GPU related items there. So you can see right now we've got our presented average FPS and our presented FPS 1% lows. We are here frame time and GPU busy time. So that's how long the GPU is staying busy. This is the average frame time right there in milliseconds. Currently right now, because it's in the background, it's rendering very slowly, but if I bring it to the foreground, you can see everything speeds up significantly. And that's just because of the way that the APIs are designed. When a game is in the background and not in the foreground, why burn up your GPU temps for no reason? It really starts to reduce its render rate. That's why it's showing so slow. But if I come back to the foreground here, GPU temperature, this is an average, by the way. So keep that in mind. If you want to show actual raw temps, you would have to set it that way and not just have it be the average. We also have power and temp, and that's all that's essentially going to show us, even though it's not currently showing up for some reason. And then custom is the one that we have set up for our testing. So you can see right here, we've got CPU busy and GPU busy. This was actually set up by Steve. These are the 2 figures he uses. Our GPU temperature, our frequency, our util, and then our memory size used average. It's using 11.1 gigabytes right now, and our sustained power limit, 450 watts. Forbidden West might not be the best title to necessarily try and like show you what CPU and GPU bound look like, but this is, okay, I guess we want to go for a swim. So this is a good example though of how the GPU and CPU work in tandem. You see the chart is like very much the same. But if our CPU line, which is the blue one, starts to get real high and our GPU line is real low, you would then start to see util drop which would mean that we are CPU bound at that point. But right now, even though their lines are not touching, they're pretty close. 10.7 millisecond average for the GPU, 11.9 millisecond average for the CPU. You can see we're only getting 87, 88 FPS. This is 4K, like maxed out settings. So we are asking a lot of the GPU. But the CPU has a lot of work to do in this game too, because it is such an open world. All right, this is not just because Steve absolutely hates heaven with a passion, but it's about the only way we can show you what a true GPU bound should look like on the graphs. So the yellow line right here is the GPU busy time. Because we're running this in like 4K right now with tests at maxed out at 8x MSAA, you can see right now it's taking 11.1 milliseconds for the GPU to render the frame, but the CPU is pretty much only busy for a fraction of that because the CPU is not really doing anything in this test. It's just, it handled the process and that's it. So this is an example of knowing your GPU is literally what's holding back your performance. So the reason why we're getting the 69 FPS is because the GPU possibly cannot render anymore. Doesn't matter if we put in a faster CPU or overclocked it or put in faster RAM or anything, the GPU is holding back the performance. But that is not a real scenario here. Like this is almost never going to be the case in games. Okay, so here we are now in Cyberpunk 2077. This is RT medium, 1440p, no DLSS, no upscaling, no frame gen. So this is just raw horsepower of the GPU handling all of this. Now you can see the GPU in pretty much every single game is going to be below the CPU line. The CPU is busy handling a lot of stuff outside of just, obviously your computer has to run with the CPU, all background processes, any updates taking place, any background software you might have running, if you have any tabs open, if you have Spotify open, if you have Discord open, all that is handled by the CPU. Not only that, when you're running a game, as the CPU is having to prepare all the frames for the GPU to render, that's added processing time that the CPU has to be able to do something on all of those instructions. So the GPU is always going to be below the CPU in average scenarios. If it is a very GPU bound game, you would see that yellow line get much closer to the blue line. In this instance, yours may not be yellow and blue. I'm not sure what your default colors are going to be, but the GPU line would be much closer to the CPU, or unless it's a game that truly is just like maybe a top down or a side scroller or something when the CPU is doing nothing, then your GPU might be above the CPU line if it's not a like frame capped game when it comes to the engine capabilities. I left that volume very loud. Anyway, I digress. So this is what a more realistic scenario will look like. Now, it might look like they're really far apart. Keep in mind that the scale is logarithmic, so it's always going to be changing based on what the average of the last 10 seconds is, because that's what I have it set to. So right now you can see our difference, our gap right here is only 2 milliseconds between our CPU and our GPU in terms of the scale. So as I move around though, we do other things, you'll see that scale will change. Now it's 10 as the min, 15 as the max. Right, as we do stuff, you can see our FPS changes, which means obviously our busy and GPU times are going to change. But I'm showing you this because that's what's useful to truly try and determine if you're bottlenecked. Now that doesn't necessarily mean if your GPU is coming up close to your CPU like we're seeing here, and we are seeing our util be in the high 90s, like it's not always going to be 100%. It's rare that you get 100%. 97 to 100% means still fully GPU utilized. If you start seeing low 90s, high 80s, 70s, 60s, now you are truly CPU bottlenecked at that point. So you might have to determine whether or not a CPU upgrade or an overclock or potentially an upgrade, to be honest, would be what's holding you back. Now this is a 9800 X3D that is overclocked to 5.3 gigahertz locked. There's no sort of fluctuation allowed into it. It is just running 5.3 the whole time. That's how our test bench is set up to keep everything as GPU variable as possible. We want the only variable to be in GPU. But this is a useful tool if you're trying to determine whether or not you're truly GPU bound or CPU bound. You can't just use GPU util to determine whether or not you're bound. And you can't just use CPU usage percentage either, because of the fact that the CPU percentage is only going to show you what the total utilization of the CPU is. So if you have a 24 thread CPU and 5 of them is all your game is allowed to run, someone's very mad and honking their horns. But if your game is only using 5, 6 threads and those threads are peaked at 100% because it's not multi-threaded beyond that, then you could still be CPU bound even though you have a lot of cores not doing anything. So that's where having a faster CPU core speed might come in more handy than having a more CPU thread count. So you've got vertical you can scale, which in my opinion for CPU would be frequency, and you've got horizontal you can scale, in my opinion, that would be thread count. So finding the balance is the hard part. I think that's why the 9800X3D is also so popular, because 8 cores, 16 thread with 3D V-cache, although at a bit of a frequency drop over like a non-X3D CPU, is still beneficial in games, but obviously it's going to take some multi-threaded workload hit like we talked about in our CPU video. But I just wanted to show you this tool because I thought that this was massive. One other thing we have to talk about now is logging. You can see right here, capture duration is set to enable. Automatically stop capture after so many seconds, yes. We have it set to 60 seconds. That's what apparently is considered acceptable as we were getting trained by Mr. Jesus himself. And what's kind of cool though is the way you know that your capture is happening is if I hit F10, it goes away. That's it. So if we're doing a manual track, you need to make sure that you run this track as consistent as possible. Fun fact, these guys crack me up. These gangbangers are obviously over here like filming for their TikTok. I mean, social media, right? And the social dilemma, it's happening, even in Cyberpunk. But once the test is done, it'll just pop back up. And then what'll happen is a CSV will be automatically generated in the captures folder within PresentMon. So should be ending any second now. There we go. Okay, so now if we come over here to, there's a couple ways you can do it. You could navigate to it automatically if you know where it's at, or you can say open in Explorer. That just automatically takes you to the storage location. Here you'll get 2 files. You'll get stats, which is just the overview of the averages. And then you'll get a full CSV readout, which will have all the frames, everything measured out. And that's how we're able to do like our frame time measurements and stuff. So here's an example of what one of those full readouts look like. I mean, it's still actually opening up. It is many lines of data in here. That means nothing to you unless you know how to turn that into something presentable. But here's just an example of what F1 2024 frame times look like based on the data that it spits out. So this chart hasn't been filled in with any like header or anything yet. It was just an example of dumping data. But you can see right here, that's a transient spike. Like all of these spikes are basically transient, and everything in the middle, that's kind of where the averages lie. But every single one of these high and low transient spikes and dips affects our average. And if we really wanted to figure out like, why is one run doing something very weird versus another run, this is the kind of stuff that you can use PresentMon to sort of figure out, and then it gives you kind of some areas to investigate. And then what you can do is you can do this with multiple GPUs. Like one of the things we'll do with the 50 series is we'll run an identical test between 4090 and 5090, and we'll compare the frame times, because all average FPS is, it's just frame time divided by 1,000. That's how many frames you can run, that's how many frames you're getting per second, and then it's that times how many seconds the game ran, and you just spit out with an average FPS number. But these kinds of things can affect your averages, so it's important to see this. So we could also see if let's say this is 4090 right here, and 5090 is a faster card, its line should be underneath it down there. So we'll be able to actually draw that, and it'll be fun to start to look at that sort of stuff. But let's just say you're like, I don't know how to do all this. I don't know how to use Excel. I don't know how to use Google Sheets to create graphs and such. Well, you have this stats page right here, which technically you can open in a notepad, and even then you might look at it and go, the hell am I looking at? Even though there's titles and stuff right there. But what I think is useful, there is a website you can go to called BECSV, or Online CSV Viewer. And then all you have to do then, choose your file, open the stats page, and then there they are, right there. So you can see we drew 5,392 frames. Our average FPS was 89.91. Our minimum was 13. Our 99% frames was 71.99. That means 99% of our frames were 79.99 FPS technically or higher. So that, if you're seeing a average FPS is high, but then our 99 or 95% are really low, then that means that we could have something weird going on. We would want to start using frame time graphs to determine what's happening with that. And then our 95th percentile says that 95% of our frames are 77.95 FPS, technically, or higher. So you can spit it out this way to get something out of it. And then max frame, it's cut off, it was 184.3 something. So that just basically took that CSV or comma separated value and turns it into a chart like that. Or you can just take it and import it into Excel if you know how to use that, or any other spreadsheet utility. So there you go. PresentMon is a very fun tool, and it's one that I know Tap has like very near and dear to his heart, and it's something I know that he's definitely looking to improve. I have not used it long enough to be able to really give any sort of improvements. I think the only thing I suggested so far would be for the graph, let us move it out farther than 10-second duration. I think up to 30 would be nice. That may be easy, that may be hard. He may have reasons for not doing that, but anyway, it would be nice to be able to see that. That way you can see a longer running average if you're just monitoring it on the screen and you're not trying to actually export it into any sort of data. With that said, I gotta get out of here because I got a lot of testing to do. We have to test a bunch of old cards with the new methodology on the new titles that we're using now prior to even getting the new cards in hand so that we can start that testing. And don't forget our giveaway, the links are down below. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm not gonna put a link to PresentMon. I think you can get it on Guru 3D. I don't remember exactly where to get it, but I don't want to necessarily accidentally crash whatever hosting site that is currently on. It's an Intel tool. Hopefully their host is good enough, but it's PresentMon, Intel PresentMon. It should look like this. All right, guys, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.